Well, welcome back to the next session. I hope you were able to discuss a few points from the first session. I want to talk about the different kinds of cities that we find in the world today. Um, and we'll start with this quote. 200 years ago, the world was 97% rural and 3% urban. By, by 2020, the world is now 55% urban. So just pause there for a while and think about that. 200 years ago, the world was 97% rural. We are in an incredible time of urbanization. And even with the pandemic that we're experiencing, I don't think urbanization is going to decrease. We're yet to see what's going to happen, but urbanization is a worldwide phenomenon, as we're going to see here as I go on. But 200 years ago, the world was 97% rural and 3% urban. Today, we are now more than 55% urban. But that's where it gets a little bit complicated now, where we start talking about what is urban and what is a city. So I'm going to give you 4 different kinds of cities that I find in the world today. And I'm mixing definitions from the United Nations and other organizations and kind of making up some of my own and using some of theirs also. So number 1, we find what's called supergiant cities. And you're looking at Osaka, Japan here as an example. A city that never ends, as far as the eye can see. And as frontier missionaries, when we look at a city like this, we have to ask ourselves, well, how many churches are in Osaka? And it would be very, very, very few. How many churches do we need in Osaka? That's a whole nother question that needs to be explored. But let me give you the 4 kinds of cities as we consider this. Number 1, there's what we call supergiant cities. A supergiant city is a city that has more than 10 million people inside of it. So here you see 35 supergiant cities in the world today. And I've put a little UA there after the word city. UA stands for urban agglomeration. That means the city and the urban area surrounding it that's connected to it. Again, for instance, like here in San Francisco, I live in a city of 800,000 people, but it's connected to Oakland, Berkeley, San Jose, and many more smaller cities like Fremont, Hayward, Santa Rosa, etc. When you take that total population, San Francisco's 800,000, but the San Francisco Bay Area, or what we call the greater San Francisco area, is 8 million people. So different countries define this in different ways. But I'm using the urban agglomeration figure here. So you might have Paris showing different populations, whether it's Paris proper or greater Paris metroplex. There are 35 urban agglomerated supergiant cities in the world today that have more than 10 million people. Now, supergiant cities are super complicated. And that's the point that I want you to remember. Supergiant cities are super complicated. And you see that here as we look at like a city like Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is a super giant city. Here you're looking at some apartment buildings. So if you're a church planner and you're wanting to go in and reach into Sao Paulo, Brazil, well, just looking at these apartment complexes, you could start many different churches in these apartment complex buildings right here. These house probably as much as many small towns do in different countries that you come from. So again, in looking at this, super giant cities are super complicated. Let me take you to Tokyo and show you the subway map. I remember when I was asked to speak in the discipleship training school in Tokyo. They put me way on the right side of the screen, and their DTS was way on the left side of the screen that you're looking at. And they took me one day by train. And if I remember right, it took about an hour and a half or so to get from one side of the city to the other on several different trains. And then they said to me, be here tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And I was left on my own. And I went to the subway station and I looked at this map and I thought, oh my goodness gracious, I need to go back to America and get my PhD just in order to understand how to ride a train in Tokyo. This is the subway map. And this next one that you're going to see, this is the overhead trains in the city of Tokyo. Super giant cities are super complicated. These are all the different cities in America, not the urban agglomeration, but the proper city population, which would be much smaller. Like, for instance, Chicago. The greater Chicago area is probably 8-9 million people, but the city itself is 4 million. So if you take these smaller populations, New York City, the proper city limits, and you put them all together, this makes up one Tokyo. Just to get you to understand how big some of these supergiant cities are. And the reason I'm doing this for you is to help you to understand, where is God calling you? Are you comfortable in a supergiant city? Some people are really gravitated towards the complexity of a supergiant city. That might be you, where you love that super complexity. New York City has more subway track than all the cities in the United States of America put together. You might enjoy that type of supergiant city structure, and you thrive in that environment. So number one, supergiant city. Number two, we call it giant cities. Now, there were 35 supergiant cities, and we now have 86 giant cities. So you see, the smaller we start going, the more numerous amounts of that type of city there are in the world. A giant city, again, using urban agglomeration, would be any city of 4 million up to the 10 million mark. And there's 86 of these cities in the world today. Now, they're not as complicated as supergiant cities, but they're complicated. They're big, but they're not as complicated. Here, the San Francisco Bay Area, where I live, and where I lived in India for 25 years, are both what I would call giant cities. I lived in Chennai, or known as Madras. It was 8 million. Now it's pushing over 10 million. It's going to the supergiant size. And now San Francisco Bay Area is a metroplex of 8 million people. You're looking here at Bogota, Colombia. So it gives you an idea. Not as complicated, but still big, and still complicated, but not super complicated. So that's number two. Number three is what we call, or what I call, megacities. And now notice we have 426 megacities. Again, the smaller we go, the more they are. These would be cities like Cartagena in Colombia, or Detroit in Michigan, or Vancouver, Canada, or Copenhagen, which you're looking at here. And Pune in India, Baku, Azerbaijan, or Mashhad, Iran. This is what you would be called more mega cities. They're large. They're not as they're not super complicated. They're not complicated. We're getting down now more to having more of a quaint feeling about some of these places. They're still large, but they definitely have more of a community feeling. I remember walking right here in this part of Copenhagen, and it's much more neighborly, is how I would put it. A sense of community starts being shared with one another. So that's the third kind of city. And the fourth kind of city is what I call frontier cities. And these are populations of 1 million and less. You're looking at Rovaniemi, Finland, up in the Arctic Circle. And this gets a little bit complicated now when you start thinking about this. And we find here that there are 4,355 urban locations that have a population between 100,000 to 1 million. That's more than 1 billion people on the planet live in these kind of cities. But if you go below 100,000 people, there's 40,000 urban locations plus, with less than 100,000 people living in them. Now, we may not call these places cities. We would probably refer to them more as towns. But they are urban. And this is what makes up the urban population of the world today. And we have many, many of these, and they're neither rural nor are they urban. On the right side of the continuum here, the more density, the more urban it is. The less density, the more rural it becomes. But these small places of under 100,000 people, I can think of many places like Uddevalla, Sweden, is a small little town, but it's very powerful. I can think of in India, places like Sivakasi, Tamil Nadu, small. Udaipur, Rajasthan, small. It's neither urban nor is it rural. It's what I would call urban. And that's kind of a word that I've made up. It's urban. And a point I want to make here is that the smaller the city, now you see on this presentation here, the 40,000 or so cities, the ones that have black markers on them are your supergiant cities. But look into this map here, and you begin to see some of the small cities. And in India, in China, and spread across the map. These are what I call frontier cities. The smaller the city, especially in Asia, I can guarantee you the fewer missionaries and the fewer churches will be there. The opposite is true in the Western world. The smaller the city, probably the more churches are there. But the smaller in the 1040 window, China, Vietnam, India, Japan, the less churches and the less missionaries you're going to find in those areas. So this is a phenomenon that's happening. Urbanization is on the rise, not only in the Western world, but worldwide. You can see here the Africa red line here, and then the Asia line looks like it's it's growing exponentially, but it's not as much urbanization as in Europe and North America and Latin America, which is represented up here. the urbanization is much more stronger up here. However, when we look at populations, now it's a different story. We find in Asia, because of the amount of people, even though the urbanization is not as strong, it's growing incredibly strong in those areas. But the urbanization is not as strong because of the amount of people compared to the world population. You find in Asia, that's where most people, when you look at it in percentages this way, the urban population is very strong in Asia compared to the Western world. All right, so I'd like you to think about this and talk about it. And maybe you can ask the question, what has changed in your understanding of cities as you begin to listen to me? What was your thought before of what is a city? Are you starting to understand? What are you starting to understand about cities? Secondly, where do you see yourself fitting in God's call? Do you see yourself in a supergiant city? Do you see yourself in a frontier city? And maybe discuss that and talk about it, and we'll come back and talk some more.